What is poppin', folks? It's time for video number 3. Hell yeah. I'm sorry about my voice. Today I'm a bit sick. My throat started hurting at like 6 o'clock last night, and since then I've just completely gone like downhill, which sucks. But obviously, like, I'm Australian, as you can tell by my accent. And I really hate that a lot of Australian YouTubers buy into the whole like, oh, I'm Australian thing, and they make Australian content like Aussie slang and that kind of thing. But I guess like when you're trying to get into the whole YouTube thing, finding like a niche or something like about you that people will want to hear about, is important sometimes. So I'm gonna do that today. I'm gonna talk about Australia. But I don't really want to talk about it in the same way that a lot of people usually do. So I'm not going to talk about like Vegemite or like slang. You know, I thought I would give you guys maybe like a little crash course on what it's like to live in Australia. So it's a pretty cool little country. I say little, but it's quite large, isn't it? We have about 25 million people living here. So for reference, I think something like 300 million people live in the United States. And I'm not even sure about like the UK, but the UK is a tiny little area, and a fuck ton of people live there. So Australia is quite it's not very densely populated because we live along the coasts where it's warmer, where it's cooler, and we don't really have a lot of business in the middle of the country. But Australia, I'm just gonna have a little wander around my house actually. Australia, I think, is a really interesting case for a lot of different things because we're a very young country. We were federated in like 1900 on the 1st of January, I believe, which is pretty recent considering, you know, the grand scheme of sort of things. And because of that, like, we don't really have a concrete sort of national identity like a lot of other countries do. So obviously Australia was born out of being a penal colony, so Great Britain was running out of space to put all the criminals and stuff that committed petty crimes like stealing and assault and that kind of thing. So they shipped them all off to Australia, and we kind of hung out there for like 100 years. And then people started actually settling in Australia, and there was the gold rush when they found like a heap of gold, and a lot of Chinese came and they began to sort of populate the country. But right up until like even into and beyond the First and Second World Wars, Australia didn't really have a sort of national identity. We were very much just like this sort of other place where people were kind of went, I guess. But following World War One, Gallipoli is something that we learn about in Australian like primary school or like early high school. Every kid in Australia knows about Gallipoli, which is it's a bay in Turkey. And during the First World War, a load of Australian and Kiwi, like New Zealand soldiers were sent to Gallipoli to do like an attack on the Turkish forces there. And essentially they were used as bait, as a distraction. And hundreds of men died, and we have memorials all over the country for the soldiers that lost their lives at Gallipoli. And that kind of marked a point in Australian history where we started to have this identity of being like a country because we fought and we came together and that kind of thing. And nowadays, like, some really typically Australian values would be this idea of like camaraderie and like mateship and egalitarianism, because we're so much a country that is made up of its parts, and we're so multicultural, and we But yeah, we're very multicultural, and we have a lot of different people and ethnicities and backgrounds and cultures and languages, and so many immigrants come to Australia. Like in the 80s and the 90s, heaps of Mediterranean and European immigrants came, and obviously during the Second World War, that's how my grandparents came here. My great grandfather was a Romanian Jew, and he fled Europe with his wife, who was a Greek woman, and they came to New Zealand, and then they moved to Australia, and that's like my family's thing. And on my dad's side, they were Italian immigrants who came. So much of like Australian culture is people ask like, oh, like, where are you from? And it's not really acceptable to just say like, oh, Australia, unless you can kind of trace back your lineage to like a settler or like a criminal from like the penal colony days. Like otherwise you say like, oh, I'm Australian, but my great grandfather came here from like, you know, China or whatever. So because of this kind of mixing of cultures, we have this sort of ideology that is everyone should be equal and everyone should have equal opportunity, and no one should put themselves before anyone else. It's this idea of like tall poppy syndrome. So the people who stand tall and think better of themselves get cut down to the level that everyone else is at. And I really appreciate that about this country. Like, we don't put a lot of emphasis on nationalism and patriotism like the USA does, and like we don't have this like white supremacy thing that a lot of other countries have, like the USA and even the UK sometimes. A massive problem with this country, though, that a lot of people don't really learn about if they're not Australian, is that when the settlers and the penalists came to Australia, there was a population of Indigenous tribal people living in the country, and they'd been there for some 80,000 years, and they were wiped out. The entire Indigenous population pretty much was just, I guess, destroyed, and so much of that cultural, oh, that lighting is terrible, cultural history and heritage has been wiped out, and we still don't really acknowledge the Aboriginal lives that were lost, and we don't talk about like the stolen generations when they took Aboriginal kids from their families and put them into white homes, and tried to essentially like train the Aboriginal out of them by putting them in white cultures and having them marry white people and have half white kids and that kind of thing. So like a lot of people will be like 1/8 Indigenous, and like that's enough to feel that connection with that culture and to get aid from the government. Because statistically, like, I think this might be the same in the USA with their Indigenous people, but there are massive problems in the Aboriginal community with like drug abuse and like, I think something ridiculous like a third, don't quote me, but like a massive amount of people who are incarcerated in Australia have Aboriginal heritage. And that's something that gets looked over a lot, but people need to learn about more, because the reality is that this country was built on the foundation of those tribes and those people and that history. Like some of the Indigenous like cave paintings here are some of the oldest in the world, and we have some really beautiful historical sites that can be traced back to tens of thousands of years ago, which is really incredible, and not enough people really know about that. But that being said, Australia still doesn't really have much of an identity, because we have our accent and we have our Vegemite and we have our, you know, our little things like that. But what's interesting actually is that of a lot of countries, if I spoke to an American or an English person, I said, okay, like, what do you think a typical, I'm sorry about the shaky caramel, what do you think like a typical Australian person would look like? And they would say, oh, like they'd be tall and blonde and tan, and they would go to the beach and they would be all like athletic and like beautiful and like whatever. But the reality is that like so few people in Australia are actually like that. Like we have such a massive Asian population in Australia, especially in Melbourne. The suburb that I live in, which I won't name obviously, has like one of the highest demographics for Asian people in like the whole state. And like if you go to a lot of the suburbs in Melbourne, like half the signs will be in Mandarin, and there'll be heaps of like services for people who are like first generation Australians. And yeah, so I think that Australia is kind of heralded as this place of like fun, laid back, like craziness, and that kind of thing, when like in reality we're a country that's really not much different from any other. And I really appreciate having grown up in this country, because it's a place that has such equal opportunity, and I'm so privileged to live in a country like this, and to attend school and have a house and have internet and have a stable and like functioning government and all that kind, and have like universal healthcare and that kind of thing. Like even sometimes just when I hear about stuff that happens in the US on the news, I think like, thank fuck I don't live there, because sometimes the USA seems so like dystopian with all of the crazy shit that happens, and like how fucked up the government is, and how like I don't know. This has been a bit rambly and it's really long, but I'm really grateful to have been brought up and born and to live in this country, because it's such a special and unique place, I feel. So yeah, that was my rant. I'll see you all next time.